So on the one hand, we're told we need a large fiscal consolidation. On the other hand, other people tell us we need a large fiscal expansion or a macroeconomic expansion. And the proponents of these two approaches say this will be the solution, this will put us on a new path of growth and development. I don't think that either arguments hold water. Does a large fiscal contraction make sense? First of all, we've got to take into account that fiscal policy does impact on aggregate demand and does weaken growth, right? So you can get into a situation where you're walking down the up escalator. You cut budgets, you raise taxes, but actually the deficit is wider at the end of the year because you've undermined growth. So then you cut taxes or you raise taxes and cut spending again, and year after year, your fiscal measures are offset by the impact of the fiscal measures on the deficit, right? And I think to a large extent, my view, I don't think there's very scientific, there's not a scientific answer to this question, but my view, and it's a view that the IMF had at least 5 years ago, is that fiscal policy is a major headwind on economic growth in South Africa today. Fiscal contraction is slowing the rate of economic growth, right? Now, there's an idea that you can have an expansionary contraction. So you will, Tito Mboweni will get up next week and announce, as the president said he must, I'm cutting expenditure and I'm raising taxes, and by next year I will have closed the deficit at least substantially, or the primary balance. That is supposed to result in a boost to investor confidence, right? Which lowers the bond rate. Because the bond rate is a benchmark rate, it lowers interest across the economy. New investment emerges. There's a virtuous cycle of growth and development. The fiscal problems are solved because growth has revived. It's a nice story, but it misses an important point. The point is that for investors to really think that your fiscal consolidation is credible, you can't just announce a cut of spending of 150 billion rand. You have to do something that makes that cut in spending real. And what do you have to do? You have to lower the salaries of public servants, or retrench a number of public servants, or lower the social grants, or reduce the rent that is distributed through the fiscal system to small business and emerging business. You have to do something which is you're going to have to reduce services, close down some hospitals, reduce some service. So you have to do something real to back up your fiscal consolidation. And any astute investor, I would think, I'm not one, I'm not an investor, I'm astute, but not an investor, would think that, okay, this government, this administration, which one of its major bases of political support is unions, whether we like it or not, is now going into battle with those unions. I emphasized before the difference, the pre-Polokwane and the post-Polokwane wage situation in the public sector. It's not an accident, in my view. There was a dividend for public sector workers for supporting Zuma. I don't think they're going to follow the current president down that path of cutting public sector wages, cutting public sector personnel. Plus the fact that if you cut public sector personnel, that is going to have an impact on the social base that depends on the public sector to maintain their consumption levels. So one way or another, in order to achieve fiscal consolidation, you require the governing party, as it is currently constituted, to impose costs on its core constituency. And an astute investor, I think, would smell the wind and realize that there's a political risk premium that's now rising, because those measures will be resisted in various ways going into the NGC later this year. And therefore, you are unlikely to have a sudden boom, a lowering of the bond rate and a sudden boom of private sector investment. You might actually have exactly the opposite. Lastly, if our main objective is structural reform, it's like you're trying to achieve something across a too broad a range of objectives. You want structural reform. You want to, again, go up against unions in Eskom, in SAA, and all of these network industries and public companies. And while you are doing that, you also want to go on the offensive in the public sector against public sector wages and conditions of service. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. On the other hand, I don't think a large fiscal expansion makes sense. First of all, as I said before, we're not in a stable debt position. A large fiscal expansion doesn't mean raising the level of debt. It means accelerating the trajectory of debt towards unsustainable levels. Secondly, there's a savings constraint, as I pointed out before. It would need to be backed by foreign inflows. Thirdly, is our problem really aggregate demand or is it supply? If you don't have the electricity to grow the economy, I'm not sure what the consequence of aggregate demand stimulation would be. Of course, there are strong arguments around public sector infrastructure investment, but I'll come back to that. So in my view, fiscal policy is not the source of the problem and not the solution to the problem either. So in conclusion, I would argue we need to commit to a controlled but moderately less contractionary fiscal stance, allowing debt to increase in the medium term. We need to negotiate a trade-off for that position, and that would be real decisions on state-owned company reform, particularly ESCOM, but also obviously SAA, but also Transnet and others, because essentially, in my view, the public sector is a constraint on private sector investment because of the way it's managing network industries. So that, to me, is the core structural problem that we're facing. And if the trade-off is that, let us address this core structural problem. Let us mobilize private sector investment into energy and broadband and airlines, maybe. But in return, we will take our foot off the fiscal brake. To me, that would be a deal worth making. But I also think there's a space for a public sector compact, a compact between public sector unions and the state around fiscal policy and incomes. In my view, it's not a question of reducing the salary bill. It's a question of trading off between salary enhancements and headcounts. That we are, as I say, we have rising learner education. We need more teachers. We need more nurses. We need more doctors in the public service, because the absence of that headcount growth is undermining public services and ultimately undermining our prospects for economic growth. So in order to get more nurses and more teachers and more police officers, we should be prepared, or we should subdue wage increments. That's the deal we need to put before the public sector unions. But that means that the total compensation budget is not going to reduce substantially because you're having higher headcounts but lower salaries. And then we can, and I think we should, negotiate this issue of the decumulation of quasi-public financial assets. I said earlier that if we were to issue foreign bonds, we would lose one of our major macroeconomic advantages, and that is the absence of currency mismatch in the structure of our liabilities. We have another major macroeconomic advantage, and that is pension fund assets as a share of GDP. There are 4 countries in the world that have pension fund assets as a share of GDP that are in South Africa's league. It's the USA, Britain, Australia, and South Africa. All have pension fund assets of somewhere in the region of 100% of GDP. No other country in the world comes close. So now this gives us a major macroeconomic advantage. It smooths, it cushions our macroeconomic disturbances. In my view, this is one of the major reasons why we have not had a major macroeconomic crisis of the kind that you see emerging, for instance, in Argentina. But on the other hand, something like the UIF, while everyone is facing these austerity conditions, is accumulating this massive resources year after year. And I don't see why we shouldn't, in negotiation with labor and business, not invest the money for a return, no. Take the money and give it to credible public agencies who are able to execute public infrastructure investments. So give it to SANRAL. Let's stop arguing about e-tolls. Just give the UIF money to Sunral and say, go out and build roads, build GFIP2, build the roads that are needed in Cape Town, build the roads that are needed in Durban. They have the plans, they've done the feasibility studies, they're ready to go. All that's holding them back is this endless dispute about e-tolls. And that's the slide I skipped. The problem of infrastructure is not a financial problem, it's a policy problem. We don't have road building because we're still discussing e-tolls. We don't have water construction because we have a collapse of the Department of Water. But we have a TCTA that can raise borrowing to finance water infrastructure. We don't have broadband investment because we've been waiting for digital migration for the last decade. We don't have decent housing construction because huge funds in housing are misdirected into a flawed policy framework. So there's many examples, but instead of addressing those problems, we say, no, let's have an infrastructure fund that can raise, the problem is not finance, the problem is policy. So if we were to take 100 billion, 50 billion from the UIF and give it to Sunral, give it to the metros, give it to the TCTA, give it to the IDC, give it to the DBSA and say, spend this money on necessary infrastructure. I think that should be something that we should be discussing. Because while this huge accumulation of pension fund assets sits there, it's sticking out like a sore thumb. And if we take an approach that says we're not prepared to have any discussion of this huge stock of savings that we have, instead, it's religiously intolerable, it's haram to touch pension fund assets. I have a feeling that we're going to go down a very dangerous path. It's better that we begin having this discussion and have it seriously. So lastly, it goes back to the political risks. If there is a need for a fiscal adjustment, and if that fiscal adjustment must be backed by a real burden that is going to be imposed on the constituencies of the ruling party, I don't think that's going to work. There needs to be a sense that this burden is being shared between different sectors of the economy. And therefore, we need also with business and the elite a discussion about real compromises, about taxation, about the use of the mobilization of savings, maybe about the institutions that we create to deploy those savings. But we can't impose, as Gina was saying, if she's right, that we had an equilibrium of 5% growth, and now we're in an equilibrium of 1% growth, and we need to adjust to that reality. The burden of that adjustment can't be imposed solely on the black poor. And the idea that the solution is purely a fiscal adjustment is essentially doing that. The alternative is to carry on like we're doing, muddling through, containing the rise of debt by eroding the asset structure of the public service. And that will lead us into a situation where the public sector is not only weak, but is incapable of leading development at any time in the future, no matter who is in government. So we need to get real and make real compromises. Thank you.